In medieval Europe, banquets were not just an excuse to fill one's stomach. They were a spectacle of power, a display of wealth, and, more than once, a test of endurance for diners facing dishes as ambitious as they were risky. These gatherings could last hours, sometimes days, and were the perfect stage for forging alliances, settling disputes, or simply boasting that your pantry held more spices than the lord of the neighboring castle. It wasn't uncommon for a noble to choke on a pheasant bone while trying to impress an ambassador, or for a servant to rush in panic to prevent a roasted boar from hitting the floor. Banquets were a culinary battlefield, where cooks played at being alchemists, servants were unsung heroes, and diners navigated a maze of protocols, intense flavors, and aromas that weren't always a gift to the senses. If you've ever complained about lukewarm soup, imagine facing a roasted swan served with a sauce fermented since the last solstice. Welcome to the fascinating, chaotic, and sometimes bewildering world of medieval banquets. The Middle Ages, spanning from the 5th to the 15th century, was an era of extreme contrasts. While peasants survived on stale bread, turnip soup, and hopes for a decent harvest, nobles and royalty hosted feasts that would make any modern chef pale. Banquets were not daily affairs, even for the wealthy. They were reserved for special occasions: coronations, weddings, military victories, visits from foreign ambassadors, or religious celebrations like a patron saint's feast. They were a tool of power, a stage where a lord could cement his prestige or, if things went wrong, become the court's laughingstock. When a noble decided to throw the house out the window, they did so with such enthusiasm that they sometimes forgot medieval windows were little more than holes in the wall, letting in icy drafts that tested the endurance of tapestries and diners alike. The typical setting for a banquet was the great hall of a castle or manor, the beating heart of elite social life. Picture a vast room with high ceilings supported by wooden beams that creaked as if whispering centuries-old secrets. The walls were draped with tapestries depicting epic battles, biblical stories, or heroic hunts, though their main purpose was to fend off the relentless cold of stone walls. The floor, covered in rushes or straw, was a functional chaos. It soaked up food scraps, wine spills, and, hopefully, not too many puddles of questionable origin. Changing the rushes was a task done every few weeks, if the lord was in a good mood, meaning the floor could become an olfactory museum of past banquets. At the center of the hall, a long table dominated the space, often draped with white linen tablecloths, a luxury that screamed wealth, as keeping them clean in an age without washing machines was a feat worthy of a troubadour's song. The high table, elevated on a platform, was the place of honor where the host and their most important guests, a king, bishop, or duke with an overly large entourage, sat. From there, they could survey the lesser diners, who crowded around lower tables, vying for a piece of bread or a decent view of the spectacle. Seating arrangements were a diplomatic art. Placing a guest in the wrong spot could be taken as an insult, and the servants tasked with this duty had to be as cunning as a royal advisor. A foreign ambassador expected a seat near the host, while a minor knight might end up at the far end, sharing a bench with a chatty merchant or a cleric with a suspicious cough. Benches were common, forcing diners to share space, which could get awkward if your neighbor deemed bathing an unnecessary luxury. The food was, without question, the star of the show. Medieval banquets weren't just about nourishment. They were a display of excess, creativity, and, at times, sheer bravery. The number of dishes served was a direct measure of the host's wealth. A modest banquet might feature a dozen dishes, but in royal courts, like those of Richard II of England or Philip the Good of Burgundy, it wasn't uncommon to serve over 100. Each course was a wave of flavors, colors, and aromas designed to dazzle guests and, hopefully, make them forget the 3-day cart ride to reach the castle. Cooks were not mere chefs. They were artists, alchemists, and sometimes magicians, transforming a questionable piece of meat into something fit for a king, or at least presentable enough to avoid gagging. Meat was the undisputed queen of the table. In an era when peasants only saw meat at festival days, nobles flaunted their access to it. Pork, beef, lamb, and chicken were staples, but high-end banquets went far beyond. Boar, venison, hare, pheasant, swan, and even peacock could grace the table, presented with a theatrical flair that rivaled a stage play. The peacock, for instance, was a favorite in English and French courts. It was roasted whole, its feathers reattached to make it appear alive, and carried into the hall on a silver tray amid applause and gasps of awe. Carving it was a spectacle in itself, though the meat could be so tough that some preferred to admire it rather than eat it. Game was especially prized, as forests were reserved for the nobility, and hunting a deer or boar required royal permission or, at the very least, a lord with enough land to flout the law. Fish also held a prominent place, particularly during religious fast days like Fridays or Lent, when red meat was forbidden. Rivers and seas offered an impressive variety. Trout, salmon, carp, eels, herring, and, for the wealthiest, sturgeon or even marine mammals like porpoise, considered fish by medieval logic. In coastal areas, oysters, mussels, and clams were common, but transporting them inland was a logistical challenge. Without refrigeration, fish could arrive in a state requiring a brave nose and an even braver sauce to mask any suspicious odors. Eels were a delicacy, often cooked in jellies, stewed with herbs, or baked into pies, though their slippery texture wasn't to everyone's taste. Sauces were a culinary obsession, not mere accompaniments but essential components of a dish. Cooks labored to create exotic blends, combining ingredients that might make modern palates hesitate. Sauces could be based on wine, vinegar, meat juices, herbs, spices, fruits, or even blood. Green sauce, made with parsley, mint, garlic, vinegar, and breadcrumbs, added a fresh touch to heavy meats. Cameline sauce, with cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and toasted bread, offered a sweet and spicy flavor that could transform a piece of venison into something almost magical. These sauces not only enhanced flavor but also masked the taste of food that had spent too long in a barrel or cart. In an age without refrigerators, a good sauce was the difference between a memorable banquet and a trip to the physician. Spices were the star ingredient, valued not just for their flavor. Pepper, cloves, cinnamon, ginger, saffron, and nutmeg were worth more than gold. A sack of pepper could pay a night's wages, and saffron, requiring thousands of crocus flower stigmas, was a luxury reserved for kings and archbishops. Spices didn't just showcase wealth, they carried a mystical aura. According to humoral medicine, they were believed to balance the body's humors, curing everything from a cold to a broken heart. They also acted as preservatives, crucial when meat might start smelling adventurous before reaching the table. A banquet without spices was like a knight without a sword, simply not respectable. Bread was another cornerstone, but not the soft white loaf we know today. For nobles, bread was made from finely milled wheat flour, known as white bread or manchet, a status symbol. Peasants, meanwhile, ate dark breads of rye, barley, or even peas, which could be so hard they doubled as weapons in a pinch. At banquets, bread wasn't just eaten, it served as a plate. Trenchers, thick slices of stale bread, were used as bases for meats and sauces, soaking up juices like an edible sponge. At the end of the feast, these slices could be eaten, given to servants, or, in a gesture of charity, distributed to the poor waiting outside the castle, hopefully not too soggy with sauce. Vegetables, though present, were not the stars. In the medieval mindset, vegetables were peasant food, and nobles focused on meat. Still, a respectable banquet might include onions, leeks, cabbage, turnips, carrots, and peas, often cooked into an unrecognizable mush. Salads existed but weren't like today's. They might include fresh herbs, edible flowers like violets or nasturtiums, and raw vegetables, dressed with vinegar, oil, and spices. Fruits, on the other hand, were more prized, especially exotic ones like figs, dates, pomegranates, or oranges, brought via trade routes from the Mediterranean or beyond. Apples and pears were common, often cooked in wine, honey, or spices for a sophisticated touch. Drinks were as vital as the food, and water was rarely the star. Clean water sources were scarce, and no one wanted to risk diarrhea mid-banquet. Wine reigned in southern regions like France and Italy, with varieties imported from Bordeaux, Tuscany, or the Rhine, often sweetened with honey or spices to soften their acidity. In the north, beer and mead dominated. Medieval beer was thick, cloudy, and often brewed with herbs instead of hops, giving it a flavor that might surprise modern palates. Mead, made from fermented honey, was a northern court favorite, its sweetness perfect for heavy dishes. Drinking was communal, with shared goblets passed from hand to hand, which could be a bonding experience or a health risk, depending on your neighbor's hygiene. Table etiquette was an art as crucial as the food itself. Banquets were laden with rules, and breaking them could be as grave as spitting on the king's plate. Diners washed their hands before and after eating, a ceremonial ritual with servants bearing water jugs and towels. Eating with hands was the norm, though nobles used knives and spoons. Forks, though emerging in the Mediterranean, were rare and often seen as eccentric. A noble might flaunt a personal knife with an ivory handle, not because it cut better but because it screamed wealth. Plates and cups were shared, requiring trust or at least a willingness to ignore your tablemate's cough. Food scraps fell to the floor, where castle dogs, ever present, handled the cleanup. The rushes absorbed the worst, but it wasn't uncommon for a banquet to end with a floor resembling an edible battlefield. Entertainment was essential, as no one wanted bored guests between courses. Troubadours sang ballads of impossible loves or heroic deeds, while jongleurs juggled, told bawdy jokes, or performed acrobatics that might end with a foot in the soup. At extravagant banquets, subtleties, edible sculptures of sugar or marzipan depicting castles, dragons, or religious scenes, were presented. These artworks were more for admiration than eating, though a drunken guest might try biting a tower. Some banquets featured theatrical performances or mock battles, with servants dressed as knights fighting for the crowd's amusement. In a famous 1378 Paris banquet, guests were stunned by a giant pie from which a jongleur emerged playing a flute, a trick as impressive as it must have been cramped for the flutist. Religion shaped banquets as much as politics. The Middle Ages were deeply religious, and the liturgical calendar dictated what could be eaten and when. During Lent or Fridays, red meat was forbidden, and banquets adapted with fish or vegetarian dishes. The wealthy, however, found ways to bend these rules, creating dishes like mock venison, made from fish shaped to look like meat, or using almond milk as a cream substitute. Banquets often began with a prayer or blessing, and in devout courts, a chaplain read Bible passages while diners tried not to stain their tunics with sauce. Monasteries, though associated with austerity, weren't strangers to banquets. Some abbots were famed for feasts rivaling those of any feudal lord, serving wines and cheeses that belied their vows of poverty. The logistics of a banquet were a feat worthy of a general. Medieval kitchens were organized chaos, with dozens of cooks, assistants, and servants working over wood-fired ovens and open hearths. Spices and exotic ingredients arrived via long trade routes, requiring meticulous planning. Animals were often slaughtered the same day, and cooks had to use every part, from tongue to tripe. Nothing was wasted, or so they tried, though castle dogs were always ready to help with scraps. Castle pantries and cellars could rival a modern supermarket, albeit without air conditioning. Food preservation relied on salt, smoke, or sheer hope, making every banquet a triumph over the era's limitations. Banquets varied by region and social class. In England, feasts were heavy on meat and beer, reflecting a cold climate that demanded hearty dishes. In Italy, Mediterranean influences brought pasta, cheeses, and light wines. In Northern Europe, mead and smoked fish were common, while in Spain, banquets might feature Arab influences with rice, almonds, and citrus. Urban guilds and confraternities held their own banquets to flex their growing wealth, while monasteries offered more subdued feasts, though not always as austere as you'd think. Even peasants had moments of abundance at patronal feasts or weddings, though their banquets typically featured barley stews and, if lucky, a bit of bacon. Politics was as vital an ingredient as the food. A banquet could be a negotiation field, where lords sealed alliances or settled disputes over a leg of lamb. But it could also be a stage for betrayal. While poisonings were rare, and likely exaggerated by chroniclers, it wasn't uncommon for a host to humiliate a rival with a mediocre dish or a seat far from the high table. Food was power, and wielding it was as crucial as swinging a sword. In 1363, during Edward III of England's coronation, 1,000 dishes were served to 600 guests, a display of might that made it clear the king spared no expense, not even on roasted swans. As the Middle Ages progressed, banquets grew more elaborate. In the 14th and 15th centuries, with the rise of Renaissance courts, feasts began incorporating influences from the Islamic and Byzantine worlds. Cooks experimented with new ingredients like sugar, which started replacing honey as a sweetener. Cookbooks like Le Viandier by Taillevent offered detailed recipes for dishes blending sweet, savory, and sour flavors in ways that might seem odd today. A meat pie, for example, could include dried fruits, spices, and a dash of vinegar, creating a flavor explosion that defied modern notions of culinary harmony. Banquets weren't without problems. Food could spoil, servants could err, and guests could get drunk and start a fight before the third course. Foodborne illnesses weren't uncommon, and while no one spoke of food poisoning, more than one diner likely regretted trying that eel in sauce. Banquets were costly, and many lords went into debt to host an event matching their reputation. In 1429, at a London banquet, a drunken knight accidentally set a tapestry ablaze, turning the night into an anecdote troubadours sang about for years. Yet despite the risks, banquets were a testament to human ambition, a celebration of life, power, and community, where every bite carried the weight of history. The text continues with a detailed exploration of additional aspects of medieval banquets, delving into specific historical examples to illustrate their diversity and significance. For instance, it describes Edward III's 1363 coronation banquet, where 60 cooks prepared 1,000 dishes for 600 guests, including roasted swans, venison pies, and a marzipan dessert shaped like a castle. This event, held in Westminster, was a power display that solidified the king's authority after a military victory. Regional variations are explored in depth. In Castile, banquets incorporated Arab influences with dishes like saffron rice and almonds, while in Saxony, feasts focused on heavy meats and thick beer, reflecting the cold northern climate. In Italy, Renaissance courts like the Medici in Florence introduced pasta and cheeses, paired with light Tuscan wines. A lengthy section covers logistics, describing the chaos of medieval kitchens, where cooks worked with wood-fired ovens and open hearths, handling ingredients often transported over long distances. It mentions a 1387 incident in Paris when a shipment of spoiled oysters forced cooks to improvise an herb soup to save the banquet. Food preservation challenges are detailed, with techniques like salting, smoking, and vinegar use, and how cooks turned offal into sophisticated dishes, like the offal pie served at a 1401 Bruges banquet. The role of women is analyzed in depth, highlighting their influence in organizing feasts. In 1415, the Duchess of Burgundy oversaw a banquet reconciling rival factions, featuring 12 courses and a juggler's mock battle performance. Social dynamics are described, including the pressure on women to maintain composure at the table, even as male guests got drunk and sang bawdy ballads. Rare cases are noted, like Queen Eleanor of Aragon acting as a primary host, showcasing her skill in court politics. Entertainment receives special attention, with vivid descriptions of troubadours, jongleurs, and subtleties. A notable example is the 1378 Paris banquet, where a giant pie released live birds when cut, leaving guests both amazed and baffled. Anecdotes of mishaps add humor, like the 1429 London banquet where a drunken knight set a tapestry on fire, immortalized by troubadours. These stories show how banquets could shift from grandeur to chaos in an instant. The politics of banquets is explored with specific examples, like the 1398 banquet at Charles VI's court, where a misassigned seat sparked a diplomatic dispute, or the 1360 Poitiers banquet, where a peace treaty was sealed with an 80-dish feast. It describes how servants acted as spies, passing messages between diners, and how food was a power tool. A mediocre dish served to a rival was a subtle insult, while a perfect feast could win an ally. Social differences are also detailed. While nobles enjoyed exotic delicacies, peasants made do with simple stews at rare communal banquets. In 1327, a Yorkshire village celebrated with a shared pig among 50 families, a rare luxury. Urban guilds, like Bruges weavers in 1402, hosted banquets to rival the nobility, while monasteries, like Westminster in 1298, served feasts that challenged their austere image. The evolution of banquets is described with a focus on the 14th and 15th centuries, when the Renaissance brought new culinary techniques. Cookbooks like For Me of Curry and Libro de Arte Coquinaria introduced recipes blending sweet, savory, and sour, like a meat pie with plums and vinegar. The arrival of sugar-transformed desserts, with marzipan and jellies becoming symbols of sophistication. In 1468, the Duke of Burgundy featured a marzipan lion at his wedding banquet, impressing foreign guests. Logistical and economic challenges are addressed with examples. Hosting a banquet could bankrupt a lord, as happened to the Duke of Burgundy in 1468, who borrowed from Florentine bankers. Mistakes were common. In 1347, an English lord was mocked for watery soup, inspiring a satirical ballad. Cooks were adept at improvisation, like in 1387, when a spoiled fish stew was saved with a spice-heavy sauce. Thus, medieval banquets, with their blend of opulence, chaos, and culinary daring, were far more than mere meals. They were a mirror of an era where power was measured in spices, diplomacy in seating, and courage in tasting a dish of dubious freshness. As the troubadour's final notes faded and dogs rummaged through the rushes for feast scraps, diners departed, some staggering from wine, others murmuring about alliances sealed or grudges born. Each banquet left stories that jongleur turned into songs, and though castles have aged and recipes have faded, the echo of those feasts lingers, reminding us that in the Middle Ages, a good host fed not just the body but the soul of a society that celebrated life with every bite, however risky it might be.